There has been a lot of terrifying violence in the news lately. It's been on both large scales and small. The horrific violence that was inflicted on Israeli people in the October 7th attacks has been reciprocated a hundredfold with bombings and shootings and blockades, reducing Gaza to uninhabitable rubble and killing tens of thousands of people, mostly ordinary civilians. The war in Ukraine drags on and on. And then in the past few weeks, Israel escalated its long-running conflict with Iran to large-scale military attacks and managed to draw the USA into participating in the bombing. Closer to home and on a much smaller scale, we've seen footage of gangs of teenagers attacking each other with machetes in the Northland shopping centre. And then a couple of weeks later, in the same shopping centre, someone trying to flee from police crashed a stolen car through the glass doors, drove at speed through the shopping mall, and then crashed out through another set of doors at the other end. Pretty scary stuff, not incidents that you want to get in the way of. I don't think there's been any religious rhetoric involved in the shopping centre incidents, but in the conflicts in the Middle East, religious justifications are constantly being evoked. We've heard Benjamin Netanyahu espousing some very dubious interpretations of things from the Hebrew Bible to justify his extreme aggression. And of course, both Hamas in Gaza and the ruling regime in Iran appeal to Islamic ideology to promote their violent hostility towards Israel and Western nations. Not that we Christians can point the finger. Attempts to co-opt Christianity to justify slaughtering our enemies seem to go all the way back to the first disciples, because tonight we heard of two of them asking Jesus whether he wanted them to firebomb a village that had not sided with them. Don't be fooled into thinking that their talk of commanding fire to come down from heaven meant anything less than offering to be God's arsonists. To be fair, these disciples had reason to be pretty scared. They were in hostile Samaritan territory known today as the West Bank. Being rejected would have come as no surprise. Better strike quickly before they strike us, just like Netanyahu said. After all, God is on our side, they figured. How we respond to the violence of the world around us is very much a faith issue. It is absolutely central to the message of Jesus and to our following of him. For most of us, most of the time, it is not about whether we will personally participate in the violence, but about whether we will hide behind a culture of violence done in our name, or come out from behind it and risk an alternative. My personal journey with these questions has been illuminating for me. I spent most of my life turning the other cheek because I knew that if I hit back, I would only further antagonize my attackers and come off second best. That is not turning the other cheek as a courageous faith choice. That's turning the other cheek because one is not equipped with any realistic alternative. But then in my mid-40s, when I got sick of sitting outside my daughter's Taekwondo class waiting to drive her home, I joined the class. And 10 years later, I was fairly competent. And it was only a mistimed change of schools that stopped me ending up with a black belt. Acacia got hers and went on to become an instructor. Now, not only did that mean that I felt very differently about my options whenever I found myself in a situation that could turn violent, but I also found myself in a place of some ideological conflict in the class because our instructors regularly told us that if we were ever under threat in real life, we should act fast and brutally to neutralize the danger in the first few seconds. And for the first time in my life, I might realistically have been able to do that. But before I'm a follower of Taekwondo, I am firstly a follower of someone who is willing to be crucified rather than violate his love for his enemies. I hope I remember that if and when, quite literally, push comes to shove. In all honesty, though, the fact that I now have some skills in hand-to-hand self-defense does not make my fear of chaotic violence much less than anyone else's. Not only are my skills waning with age, but the truth is that when some deeply disturbed person starts shooting an assault rifle into a crowd or driving a car at speed through a shopping mall, my best jumping back kick is going to be no more effective than standing there screaming. Tonight, we heard the Apostle Paul saying, "For freedom, Jesus has set us free." What does it mean to be set free when we live in a world that is racked by violence and gripped by fear? If you listen to some Christians, it sounds like nothing more than a free entry ticket to heaven after you die. But Paul is quite clearly talking about a freedom that has implications on this side of the grave. He talks about how we use our freedom, and he talks quite specifically about hostility and conflict. Did you notice his contrasting lists of what he called the works of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit? We tend to mishear the first one all the time because we are so used to hearing works of the flesh as just meaning things like fornication and drunkenness. And those things were on the list, but there was a lot more on the list than that. Listen again to the heart of the list: enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy. That's not the sort of family values crap that the wowsers and morality police bang on about. These are precisely the sorts of things that ignite the violent hell that we've turned this world into. The other half of the list, fornication, impurity, licentiousness, drunkenness, carousing, are the sorts of things that we do to numb the pain and calm our fear and distract ourselves from the hellfires that we've lit. So when the apostle talks about Jesus setting us free from a yoke of slavery, he's talking about a world enslaved by enmity, conflict, jealousy, anger, and factions. He's talking about Jesus breaking us free from a system where those things lock us into patterns where every insult or injury is countered by an obligatory retribution that escalates into another and another. He's talking about Jesus showing us a way out of the eye for an eye system where vengeance masquerades as justice and simply perpetuates the climate of violence and fear, driving us behind locked gates and crippling us emotionally and spiritually, if not physically. Most of the time, though, we miss what Jesus is saying. We don't have ears to hear because we have been convincingly sold the lie that the violence that protects us is good violence done on the authority of God. If the truth be known, religion probably isn't the cause of violence nearly as much as violence is the cause of much of our religion. Because we invent religious frameworks and religious laws and religious distinctions between good people and bad people to justify resorting to violence to keep those we fear at bay. We persuade ourselves that we're not resorting to violence because we're scared or hateful, but because God is using us to bring a dangerous world under control. There are a whole bunch of mass shooters who have seen themselves as holy warriors obeying God's call to purge the world of evil. Even after several years with Jesus, the disciples James and John can still imagine that he might endorse their angry urge to firebomb a town that has not welcomed their version of the truth, because they still believe in an angry, violent God who hates sinners and unbelievers and probably foreigners. And so they think that surely Jesus is going to bring out the fire and the sword sooner or later. Is now the time? After all, they had recently witnessed Jesus' transfiguration on the mountaintop and seen him talking with Elijah. Elijah had slaughtered 450 of his religious rivals. And if our first reading tonight had continued for a few more verses, we'd have read the horrifying story of his successor Elisha setting wild bears on a group of youngsters whose sin was to yell, "Piss off, Baldy," at him as he walked past. 42 kids were killed. If he did that today, we'd regard him as a mass murderer and he would be facing life in prison without parole. In a culture that celebrates the zealous violence of Elijah and Elisha as a godly thing, is it any wonder that, according to a survey, 82% of Jewish Israelis supported the attack that brought down fire from the sky on Iran? They're scared and they believe in good violence. It's certainly easy to see why James and John could think that a little fire from the sky might be in order for a town of dangerous heretical foreigners who wished them ill. But Jesus will have none of it. He rebukes their fear-fueled hostility and their desire to be the agents of divine vengefulness. Some ancient copies of Luke's gospel even have Jesus going further and saying, "You don't know what kind of spirit has got into you, for the Son of Man hasn't come to destroy anyone, but to save them." You can still find that line in the King James Version, but most scholars now agree that it wasn't in Luke's original. But the ancient scribe who added it may not have been a very good copyist, but he got what Jesus was on about a lot better than James and John apparently did. Tonight, we heard the Apostle Paul say that in the emerging culture of God, the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. One rule is all you need. Frightened people are suckers for an old-fashioned law and order campaign, as we see not only in Israel and Iran, but in the local responses to the violent incidents in shopping malls. We create endless laws to divide everyone and everything into good and bad. Most religions have used strict sets of rules to bring the world under control. And whenever we have tried to turn Jesus back into an expression of that kind of old familiar religion, his church too has become known for trying to outlaw everything and prohibit everything. But it was Jesus who Paul was quoting when he said the whole law is summed up in the one commandment to love your neighbor. And when Jesus said that, the lawyers thought they had spotted a way out. Ah, yes, but who is my neighbor? Lawyers are always looking for loopholes. That's their job. But Jesus demolished the loopholes, saying, in essence, your neighbors include even the enemies of your nation, race, or religion. So love them all as yourself. He also told us that the thing his followers would be best known for was their love, not their fierce opposition to sin or their hostility towards immorality, their love. Love of God, love of neighbor, love of enemies. So the pathway of salvation that Jesus calls us to follow him on, the pathway to freedom from the death spiral that our anxious hell-bent culture, is not difficult to describe or explain. Paul can sum it up in a single command: love. A love that is so absolute that it involves a complete renunciation of the right to retribution, the right to demand an eye for an eye. A love that meets insult and hostility and even violence with courageous mercy and forgiveness. In our anxiety, we fear that this amounts to passively letting evil go unchallenged and violence have free rein. But Jesus is not at all passive in the face of violence. Passivity does not confront violence at all. Jesus confronts violence powerfully, but with a powerful love that is willing to suffer violence, but never to escalate it or reciprocate it. That is not going to rate well in any opinion polls, but it is the way of Jesus, clear and simple. Clear and simple, but not easy. We heard Jesus tonight expressing his doubts about 3 wannabe followers and whether they really had what it takes to follow in his footsteps. People keep putting their hand to the plow and then looking back, he says. You can't keep looking back and giving the nod to a bit of the old ways. You think you're ready to follow me in the way of love and mercy? But when push comes to shove, you want to pop back and hide behind a bit of old-fashioned lethal force. Every time you look back to the old answers, you pour fuel on the problem instead of plowing a straight furrow towards the solution. For all the apparent simplicity of Jesus' way, it is not easy. It takes courage, and he's quite uncompromising. So much so that he won't even stop loving his enemies when they torture him to death. And ultimately, in so doing, he completely rips the veneer of respectability off our authorized violence and exposes the great lie. Our so-called good violence, our official violence, state violence, far from being reliably a sword for good in the hand of God, will actually drive nails through the hand of God. It is so protective of its own power that it will even crucify the perfect embodiment of God's universal love and mercy. But when Jesus exposes the great lie, its power is broken, and the choice becomes simple in its clarity, if still difficult to fully embrace. So here again tonight, that is the choice that confronts us all. Will we be part of the problem or part of the solution? Will we plow on with Jesus into the new culture of love, or will we keep running back to the old culture where our only sense of safety was secured by armed officers in uniforms? In a few minutes' time, Jesus will offer you a piece of broken bread and invite you to feed on his love and vulnerability, and to become in your own body that same sign of brokenness and love offered for the life of the world. Jesus will be offering himself to you and inviting you to take and eat and become what you receive. No matter who you are or what you believe or what you have done, no matter how much violence you have committed or condoned or hidden behind, Jesus offers himself into your hands, bearing the wounds himself. But once you reach out your hand and take hold of the way of Jesus, there is no longer any looking back. Plow straight ahead in the love and mercy that is the culture of God.